Hey kids, so what do most people do when they want to get a good tropical experience? Well, some of the first things that come to mind are probably booking a flight to the Bahamas, Bali, or Costa Rica, or something along those lines. But here, we do things a little bit differently. So that's why today I'm going to be showing you how to make your very own one-to-one scale model of the Amazon rainforest, complete with a waterfall, a flowing river, a live tropical soil, three-dimensional background, actual trees, and all other sorts of tropical plants and mosses, along with wildlife. I'm Nico, you're watching Show Serpents. Let's get to it. But first, I had to clean out all of the sand, dirt, and trash and other nasty stuff from the last time I tried to build something with this. It also had a bunch of leftover silicone from the last project, so I needed to deal with that with a razor scraper. After all that was done, I just cleaned off the glass. Once that was done, it was time to start with the background. It's nothing special, just some bark and spray foam along with some sticks for texture and depth. Pretty similar to what I do for just about all of my bioactive vivariums. So once it's in this sort of like half-cured stage, now you can start to work with it and mold it into whatever shape you like. As you can see here, I put in some ledges and slopes and stuff like that to give it some depth and just make it look more natural rather than, a flat plane with some bark and sticks stuck to it. Once it was fully cured, I carved it down, laid down a layer of silicone, and my background mix for substrate. Once it's cured for about 24 hours, you can lift it up, watch how much substrate falls off, and see how terrible of a job you did. Because let me tell you, I never get it perfectly done on the first try. I'm pretty sure it's physically impossible. But wherever I saw any exposed foam, I covered with silicone, carved down, and patched up with some dried moss. After finally finishing up with that part, I wanted to bring a 3D element into the background, so I started placing on some small branches and twigs. However, the branches weren't being compliant. So then I went and siliconed the barrier that would separate the water from the land. After I had that cured and then had some rocks placed down, I put down a small clump of geotextile fabric right underneath the pump. This was going to act as a filter so that no sand or anything else gets caught in the filter and messes it up. I then tried to stack up some little slate rocks in order to conceal the pump. However, if I ever needed to get to the pump and something went wrong, it would be a bitch getting all of those rocks out of the way, so I just went with a simpler design like that. Finally, I dusted out the basin, and now it's time for our first water test. So far, it's doing nicely. I then turned on the very angry sounding pump and let it run for a few hours. So far, it was looking fine and there were no signs of any leaks. Well, until there was, but don't worry about that. So I got everything emptied, dried, and cleaned, and put down the barrier with probably a little bit too much silicone, but after that, I was being a little bit more than careful. Now, just about anyone who has ever made a terrarium, paludarium, or vivarium in the past has definitely experimented with their own substrate mix. The ingredients that I'm putting up on screen right now are the ones that I use and have had the most success with. I recommend it highly, but of course, you should always experiment with your own stuff and see what works for you. But before we can do anything to the substrate, we need a way to keep it separated from the drainage layer. For this, I'm using geotextile fabric. You can also use window screen mesh, and some people like to use plastic weed blocker, but that stuff is really not permeable and it kind of just sucks. So I would recommend geotextile fabric or carbon fiber window screen mesh. You don't want to use metal because it will rust. Anyways, now that we've got all of our substrate placed down, we need to get some hardscape, so I went to the best place for hardscape that I know. When looking around the river, I managed to find this stuff that looked like an odd mixture between lava rock and dragonstone. I'm not really sure what it is, but I really like the look of it, so I scattered a bunch of chunks all throughout the land portion. I then used some of the leftover sand that I had to create a sandbank, similar to what you would see on the edge of a river in real life, right next to the disgusting looking water. Don't worry, it's just murky because I added the sand. It'll all settle and look nice eventually. Okay, that's enough about the sand and the poop water. Let's actually bring this thing to life with some plants. I started out with the small pothos here. After planting some vines on this background, I decided to put in this ficus bonsai tree because what kind of jungle is complete without trees? Considering this is the first time I've ever used a tree like this inside of a paludarium or terrarium, I had to get some B-roll shots. So then right next to it, I placed this rabbit's foot fern. Rabbit's foot ferns are these beautiful, small, tropical ferns. They're also epiphytic, meaning if you just kind of like glue them onto a branch or your background, they'll grow there too, similar to a spider plant or lichen or bromeliads. But they can also be planted directly into the substrate like I'm doing here. But if you want to use rabbit's foot ferns, you need to have a very well aerated and well draining soil. This is why I included a lot of sand and sphagnum moss in my soil. I also had a bag of grass seeds, so I just kind of tossed them all about the paludarium to see what would happen. So then I had to venture into the great outdoors in search of moss. While I was out there, I also saw this little guy, and a bunch of even littler guys chilling on top of this thistle. Along with these thatching ants doing whatever this is to a leaf, thatching ants are the worst kind of ants ever. I do not like them. For the moss, I started out by planting 2 patches of haircap moss around the bonsai tree. Haircap is one of my favorite species of mosses, so I just knew I had to include it in this setup. Then I placed some hypno moss on and around this cork flat that I put in here to simulate the way moss would grow over a fallen tree. Then I put another good sized patch of haircap moss underneath these ferns here. So then I wanted to do something with the 2 rocks in the middle, so I decided to take 2 patches of fern moss, which is another one of my favorite species, and plant it in one of the cracks in between them and then in front of the other rock. Then I put another small patch of fern moss in the foreground right next to the sandbank. And while I was out looking for moss, I found some that was growing on this stick, so I decided to plant it vertically to simulate a dead tree that had been overgrown by moss. And then of course I planted some on our bonsai tree to simulate how epiphytic ferns and mosses would grow in the wild. I also read that some species of terrestrial moss are capable of surviving underwater in perfect health. So I guess we're gonna see if that's true. So now we are pretty much done with all of the planting, and all that's left to do is add in the wildlife. So I started with these little springtails. They're a great addition to any terrarium, vivarium, or paludarium because they feed on mold, so they're super beneficial in the long run. As I'm sure you can see, they are very, very tiny, but the amount of mold that a large enough group of these things can consume is just insane. For our second edition, I went with a small group of about 6 yellow spotted isopods. also known as Armadillidium gestroi or gestroi, however you pronounce it. They immediately began exploring their new humid jungle home. This one was already trying to burrow down into the substrate, as to be expected. This one was exploring his lunch options for what species of moss were around. And this one decided to go for a nice stroll on the beach. I also have a pretty large group of darkling beetle larvae, also known as mealworms. Now the group that I had like 20 or 25 individuals, so I decided to just take a small handful of 6 out and put them into the paludarium. As you can see, they too immediately began exploring and feeding on the sphagnum moss and leaf litter. And that just about covers the miniature rainforest. Here's a before and after shot from before I even cleaned it to once everything was finished.